If I move over to my slides here. So last session, if you were there on Friday, there was quite a kind of select group of us who went through a recap of the infection and response topic. So that's module 2 or 3, I think, in AQA GCSE Biology. And that's kind of what we've tried to keep to, but we have kept the content quite kind of general. So if you're studying a different specification, so not AQA, so be that OCR or WJEC, whatever you're doing, then these will still be relevant. Particularly the topic that we're doing today. So we're taking a bit of a step back today and we're looking at cell biology. So we're going right back to the start. And a lot of what we've learned over the last few weeks, so we talked a bit about organization, we talked about gas exchange in the lungs, we've talked about digestion, we talked about how water and minerals are moved around in plants, and then we went through into different types of disease, how those are passed on through pathogens. And all of that relates back to cell biology. So I thought this would be a good opportunity to kind of have a look back at the basics and double check what we know and what you need to know for exams. So we've got quite a full lot of content. If it's your first time at the online school, then this is a good time to join because we're starting kind of almost back at the beginning. If it's not, then this is a really good revision session. There will be some mini quizzes and things throughout. So if you look at the panel at the bottom of your screen, you should be able to see a Q&A tab and a chat tab. And what we generally do is any kind of answers to mini quizzes or things like that, pop them in the chat. And any questions about the content or things like, please can you go back to that slide and things like that, then pop them in the question and answer box. And I will keep an eye on those as we go through. We'll kind of have a few little stops to answer questions and do some mini quizzes and things. And we'll catch up with them then. So we'll go through some content and then I've got some past exam questions as well at the end. So we can have a look at kind of how questions on this topic would look in an exam. So there's 4 sections to today. So there's animal and plant cells, there's eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells, animal cell specialization, and plant cell specialization. If you've been studying GCSE biology for a while, these should be fairly familiar. If you are moving on to GCSE or you're going to A-level, then you'll come across these again and you'll build on them. So well worth going over again. Okay, so we're going to start with the basic structure of an animal cell. So cells are the building blocks of life. They make up every part of us. And cells in animals all have the same basic structure. So there's 5 structures that you need to remember, really. If you're going into A-level, there'll be a few more organelles that are added on. So all cells are made up of a cell membrane, which controls the movement of substances in and out of the cell. A cytoplasm, which is up here. It's a liquid in which organelles are suspended and where chemical reactions take place. Within that cytoplasm, so the cytoplasm is kind of like the body. It's a sort of water-based liquid where everything else sits in. It's where all the chemical reactions happen. And it's where all of the other kind of body parts as such of the cell are situated, and we call those body parts organelles. So an organelle is part of a cell, and the 3 that you need to know about for animal cells are the nucleus. So that contains DNA. DNA is structured as part of genes, or it's structured into genes, grouped into genes. The genes are on chromosomes, and they carry the instructions for making proteins that are needed for building new cells or taking part in chemical reactions, because remember, enzymes are also proteins as well. They are part of the chemical reactions. And so the nucleus is kind of the brain of the cell, if you want to think of it in terms of body parts. The nucleus is surrounded by a membrane, which lets stuff in and out when needed. And there's not much more to say about it. We've also got two other types of organelles. So the mitochondria, which are structures where aerobic respiration takes place. We are going to go into respiration in more detail next week, I think, possibly the week after. So we'll learn more about that there, but respiration, as we know, if you studied it before, is the production of glucose. And we use that, it's the use of glucose and to produce energy. So we use that. Respiration takes place in most of our cells within the mitochondria. We also have ribosomes, which is where protein synthesis takes place. So you can kind of see this web building here. So protein synthesis is the making of proteins. So the nucleus contains the instructions for that. The mitochondria provides the energy for that process, and then the ribosomes provides the factory where protein synthesis takes place, so where those proteins are built. Okay, so animal cells are about 10 to 30 micrometers in size. We are going to have a session on relative size and things like that. Micrometers are, so if you have a millimeter and you divide it by 1,000, you get a nanometer, and if you divide it by 1,000 again, you get a micrometer. So they are very, very small. I've also included for kind of reference some relative sizes of organelles there. So mitochondria are 0.2 to 0.7 micrometers, and the nucleus is about 10 micrometers across. So you can get a kind of an idea of the relative sizes there. Animal cells are different to plant cells. So plant cells have all of the 5 parts of an animal cell that we've talked about before. So they're here. So we can see that there's a nucleus. The cell is surrounded by a cell membrane. Oh, I've circled slightly the wrong things there. And it has a cytoplasm, and it also has mitochondria, and it does have ribosomes as well. In addition, it has 3 extra things that you need to remember when you're talking about plant cells. So plant cells have a cell wall. The function of the cell wall is to strengthen and support the cell. And it's made of a molecule called cellulose, which is very strong. Plants also have chloroplasts, which are the green organelles that you can see here. So as well as mitochondria, which are where respiration takes place, plants also photosynthesize, so they produce energy from sunlight. And that takes place in the chloroplasts. That's the name of the organelles where photosynthesis takes place. They contain a pigment called chlorophyll, which is what makes them green, and that absorbs light for photosynthesis to happen. They're about 3 to 5 micrometers in length. Plant cell itself is much bigger than an animal cell, 10 to 100 micrometers, so some of them are quite a lot bigger. And finally, the third additional feature of the cell that you need to remember for plant cells is the permanent vacuole. I'll just move this up a bit so you can read that text a bit better. Permanent vacuoles are slightly odd features of the cell. They're kind of a space in the cytoplasm. They're a bit like a balloon. They're filled with cell sap, and they keep the cell rigid. And in our lesson tomorrow, we'll learn more about why they're important. We're going to talk about how things move around in cells, and they are very important for that. But for now, we need to remember that they are filled with cell sap, and they're to do with keeping the cell rigid. So plant cells, between this vacuole and the cell wall, plant cells strive to remain turgid, is the key word that we use for them. So they want to remain plump and support themselves. So that's what gives things like plant stems and leaves and things quite a sort of strong structure. Okay, so that's plant and animal cells. Those are the 2 basic types of cell that we need to know. And both plant and animal cells, oh, I found this handy diagram actually, forgot about that one. So this is a plant cell and an animal cell next to each other. So this is quite a small plant cell. You can see it's not much bigger than the animal cell. They do get quite a lot bigger. You can see that both cells share the features that are coloured in black. So the cell membrane, which controls things going in and out, ribosomes for protein synthesis, nucleus that contains the DNA, cytoplasm, which is kind of the sort of body of the cell, it's where the chemical reactions take place, and the mitochondria for respiration. And then you can see in green the three things that we just talked about that are features of plant cells. So the cell wall for keeping the plant cell strong, giving it some structure, the vacuole, which has a similar function that's filled with cell sap, and chloroplasts, which are for absorbing light for photosynthesis. So both plant and animal cells are described as eukaryotic cells. Eukaryotic cells all have a nucleus, that's where they store their genetic material, and all have those features of plant and animal cells that we just talked about. Bacteria, however, are very different. So bacteria are single-celled organisms, and we describe them as prokaryotic cells. And they are very different from eukaryotic cells. They're much, much smaller, 0.2 to 2 micrometers. So that's about the same size as the mitochondria that we talked about as part of the animal cells. And I've got a diagram of one here. It's got a few things that are quite different looking to plant and animal cells. And I've outlined the 3 key differences that you need to know at the bottom. This comes up quite a lot in exams, looking at the difference between prokaryotic and eukaryotic cells, so it's well worth having a look. So firstly, one of the key differences between eukaryotic and prokaryotic cells is that the genetic material in prokaryotic cells isn't held in a nucleus, it's not contained. It's a single loop of DNA, you can see it kind of here. It's just kind of a string. It just hangs about in the cytoplasm. It still provides all of the genetic material for the cell, but it's arranged very differently. They can also have small rings of DNA called plasmids. They contain DNA for very specific features. So for example, we talked a lot about antibiotic resistance last week in the context of treating disease, and we talked about how bacteria can become resistant to antibiotics, and quite often the genes for that are held on these plasmids. They also may have things called flagella, which are like tails. So they're long protein strands and they help the bacteria move around. Not all of them have them, but some of them do. They can have other features as well. So this one in this diagram has got a slime capsule. Again, not always present. Some of them do, some of them don't. And you can see that it's got a cell wall, a bit like a plant cell. It's not made of the same material. It's made of something different called Glycogen. But otherwise, they do have a cytoplasm and a cell membrane that's the same as in plant and animal cells. So 3 key differences to remember at the bottom. And the size. Size is another key difference. Nice little Venn diagram that I found here. So kind of shows the differences between prokaryotes and eukaryotes. So DNA and membranes, both of them have those in the middle there. Eukaryotes are complex. They have lots of organelles. They're much larger. The DNA is protected in that nucleus, and they're animal and plant cells. Whereas in contrast to prokaryotes, bacteria are much simpler. They have few organelles. They're very small. The DNA just kind of sits there in the cytoplasm. It's not bound in a nucleus. And they're bacterial cells. That's quite a nice summary diagram. Okay, mini quiz. So let's do this first and then I'll answer any questions. So pop your answers into the chat. So which of these does not occur in an animal cell? A, cell wall, B, nucleus, C, ribosome. Couple of answers coming in there on the chat. Good. Good. Quite a few, a couple more people want to answer that first question. Pop your answer in the chat. Good. Lots of A's coming in there. So A is right. Cell walls are only in plant cells, so not in animal cells, whereas the nucleus and the ribosomes are found in both. Question 2, name 2 features of a prokaryotic cell that do not occur in a eukaryotic cell. Pop that in. 2 features of a prokaryotic cell that don't occur in a eukaryotic cell. Good, someone says flagella, that's really good. Animal and plant cells don't have those. Circular DNA, yes, that's another good answer. Those plasmids, they don't happen in plant or animal cells. Vacuoles are in plant cells rather than prokaryotic cells. Good, no, mitochondria as well. That's a good one. Good, and the difference in DNA, it's not exactly, they don't have a nucleus there. Okay, question 3, what is the function of the cytoplasm? So A, to contain the genetic material, B, protein synthesis, or C, to control movement of substances in and out of the cell. So pop A, B, or C in the chat. Few different things coming in for those. The correct answer is C. So the cytoplasm, oh, no, that's completely wrong. I don't know what I was thinking about when I did that question. Sorry, everyone. Oh no. Okay. Let's put a big cross on this. I don't know what, I think I thought that I'd written cell membrane. Okay, so function of cytoplasm. Oh dear, I could have to spell it. Is where chemical reactions take place in the cell. I never was my strong point when typing. Okay. In contrast, I think what I meant to write is a cell membrane. And the cell membrane controls what enters and leaves the cell. Well done those who had a guess and who no doubt were pretty confused by what I'd written there. But hopefully that clarifies that. Okay. So any questions about the content there so far? If you pop them in the question and answer page. Okay, no questions, I don't think. Someone has asked, can you write the conversion for micrometers down, please? We are going to go over that next week, so don't worry too much. I'm not going to go into it now because it gets quite confusing and I want to do it properly, make sure that everyone's okay. Okay, let's move on to the next section then. Oh, do all animal cells have the same things? Yes, those 5 things that we talked about that are in animal cells, all animal cells have them. There's probably some obscure exception, but for the purposes for GCSE, all animal cells have those 5 things. Okay, so the next thing that we wanted to talk about was cell specialization. So far we've kind of treated all cells as quite uniform, which they are mostly. But if you think about the different types of cell in our body, so we have muscle cells, we have cells in our lungs, we have nerve cells, we have cells in our brains, they all do different things. And so they're all, if we talk about it kind of in terms of evolution, they're all adapted to do those different things. They're all adapted for their functions. When we're born, our cells aren't quite so adapted, or certainly when we're in the very early stages of development. We have some cells that aren't adapted to do things. And as we grow older, cells differentiate, and that's the key word here. So they differentiate to form different types of specialized cells to carry out specific functions. And what this means is that they become adapted to do a specific thing. But that's the kind of definition, and the 2 key words that you need to remember here is that cells differentiate to form different types of specialized cells to carry out specific functions. Most animal cells differentiate at an early age, whereas many plant cells can differentiate throughout life. So plant cells can change from one function to another. So to put that into context and give you some examples, here are some examples of specialized animal cells. So all of these cells will have the same 5 features that we talked about at the beginning for animal cells, but the nerve cells are specialized to carry electrical impulses around the body. So that's how messages travel around our body through our nervous system, and our nervous system is made up of these nerve cells. Nerve cells look like this diagram. They all look fairly similar. Some of them are longer than others. They can be extremely long. So we have nerve cells that go from our spine to the tips of our toes. They can be very, very long. And they're made up of, so when you get questions in an exam on this topic, they are almost always explain how this cell is specialized for its function. So for each type that I've listed here, I've tried to give you those things that specialize that cell for its function. So nerve cells have things called dendrites. You can see them marked there on the diagram. They make connections to other nerve cells. So they're kind of like arms. They hold on to the next one on. They also have an axon, which is this long kind of bit here. That's what carries the nerve impulse. And that's the bit that can be very, very long. So you'll always have a dendrite at one end, and then a nerve ending at the other. And then joining them is the axon that carries the impulse. Nerve endings are adapted for passing on those impulses with special chemicals. And they also have lots of mitochondria to provide lots of energy for passing on those impulses. And you can see in the diagram, there's the nucleus there, we've got the cytoplasm in the middle, there'll be mitochondria and ribosomes through there as well. And the whole thing is surrounded by a cell membrane, as we talked about when we were talking about animal cells. So that's nerve cells. So 3 things to remember for nerve cells: dendrites, axon, nerve endings. Okay, then we've got 2 more types of animal cells that are quite specialized. So the first, or the second, is muscle cells. Muscle cells are described as being striated. And that basically means that they're long and thin, and they're staggered in their structure. So you can see here, they're kind of stacked on top of each other. They fit together. And they work together in tissues called muscles that contract and relax in pairs. So for example, our biceps and our triceps are an example of an organ pair. So when you clench your arm, you can feel your biceps contract and your triceps relax. Muscle cells are adapted to their function or specialized by, they have special proteins in them to help with the contraction. You'll learn more about that at a later date. They have lots of mitochondria for energy. So they're doing a lot of the hard work. They need lots of energy. They need to do lots of respiration to get that energy. So they need lots of mitochondria for respiration to take place. They also store a substance called glycogen. Glycogen can be broken down and used in respiration. So glucose is what's used in respiration to produce energy. Glycogen is a way of storing glucose. So muscle cells have kind of space for that to happen. So they have stores. So for example, if you're running up a hill really quickly and you can't breathe fast enough to keep getting enough oxygen in for respiration and things, and you're running out of glucose and your body just can't quite keep up because you're going so fast, then your muscle cells might start to break down the glycogen to give them some more glucose so they can produce more energy and keep you running. Okay, so 3 things for muscle cells: special proteins, lots of mitochondria, and they can store glycogen. And then finally, sperm cells. So sperm cells are specially adapted for traveling long distances to eggs. So if we think about reproduction, the sperm goes to the egg and then makes its way into the egg, and both of the sets of DNA join together. The egg is fertilized and then begins to grow into a fetus. So sperm cells have to be adapted for traveling long distances. They have a long tail for movement to help with that. They have lots of mitochondria because they're doing lots and lots of hard work. So they have lots and lots of mitochondria stored in this kind of middle piece here. They also have, kind of in their noses, or what would be their noses, an acrosome, which is a special organelle that stores digestive enzymes. Those enzymes help to break down the outside of the egg when they get there so that they can get into the egg. And then they've got a large nucleus for their size because it contains the genetic material to be passed on. Okay, so 4 things for sperm cells: long tail, lots of mitochondria, acrosome, and large nucleus. Okay. So, ready on the chat function or the chat box. So, question 1, name one way that nerve cells are specialized for their function. So, we just talked about 3 types of cell. Name one way that nerve cells, the first one that we talked about, are specialized for their function. Good, someone said that they're extremely long. Yep, that's good. What other things do we talk about? Nerve cells have axon, yes, exactly. So the axon is for conducting that electrical pulse, that nervous impulse. Nerve endings, yes, really good for passing on that impulse. And dendrites, exactly. So dendrites are what are attached to the next one on. So if you like, it's kind of dendrites at the front and then an axon and then the nerve ending. Good, okay. Question 2, name one way that muscle cells are specialized for their function. So we talked about 3 things, I think, for muscle cells. How they're specialized for their function, so helping our muscles contract. Lots of mitochondria for energy, yes, really good. That's a good one to be able to remember, actually. It applies to lots of different types of cells. Storing glycogen, yes, so they've got glucose available for respiration. Special proteins for contraction, yep. So we'll go into that more detail later on. And you'll certainly learn more about it if you take biology into A level, because it's a big part of it. But yeah, they have, I think, 3 different types of proteins that all work together to contract the muscle. It's very intricate. Okay, good. Question 3. Name one way that sperm cells are specialized for their function. So how have they differentiated in order to be specialized for getting to the egg? Long tail, yes, lots of mitochondria. The tail isn't a flagellum. That's a good point, actually. So bacterial cells have flagellum, whereas sperm cells have tails for GCSE. Those are the words you need to remember. Head, yes, has a big nucleus for lots of genetic information. Acrosome for storing digestive enzymes, yeah, really good. I think that's most of it, isn't it? Yes, lots of mitochondria for sperm cells as well. Fab. Okay, great. I'll just have a quick scroll through the questions. So any questions about specialization of animal cells, pop them in now. Do nerve cells help us have thoughts and ideas? So yes, nerve cells help us pass that information around in our brain so that we formulate those thoughts and ideas. Yes, muscles that work in pairs can be called antagonistic muscles. That's good. Go into muscles in more detail another time, but yes, exactly. Yes, okay, working out how glucose gets around the body and what it's used for is quite difficult and will become more and more clear the more biology that you study. So the food that we eat, you're quite right, is broken down, or some parts, carbohydrates, are sugars rather. So yeah, carbohydrates and sugars are broken down into glucose in digestion. Then from our intestines, they pass into the blood, and from the blood, they go to our cells. So glucose travels from the food that we eat down through our digestive system, into the blood, and then into the cells for use in respiration. So that's how glucose fits in. If it's a muscle cell and there's glucose to spare, they'll take it and they'll hoard it away and they'll store it as glycogen to make sure that they've got enough for when hard times come around. A bit like everyone stored toilet paper at the beginning of the coronavirus crisis. Okay. Do nerve cells help us send emotion to the brain? Yes, they're part of that as well. So it's the nervous system and hormones as well that are involved in emotion. Why does a sperm cell have a tail and not a flagellum? There's slightly different structures. Okay, fab. Last bit now, before we move on to do some questions. Specialized plant cells. So, there are 4 types of plant cell that you need to know about that are specialized. Some of them we've talked about already in the plant organization section, so they might be a bit familiar. Well worth going over again. But if you're just starting out with looking at plants, then this is a really good place to start, because these are 4 types of cell that are really, really involved in most plant processes. So we're going to start with root hair cells. So root hair cells are specialized for helping plants take up water and minerals from the soil. They're very, very small. They're right on the end of the roots. And they have this kind of long root hair bit that allows them to kind of reach into the soil, so in between those small soil particles, and make sure that they can get into all of the nooks and crannies and extract the water and minerals that the plant needs. They have this tail. It's not really a tail, it's a root hair, but it looks a bit like a tail. It increases the surface area And that means that more water can cross from the soil into the root hair cell and then be transported up the plant. They also have a permanent vacuole that speeds up movement of water by osmosis. Again, we're going to talk a lot about water transport tomorrow at 3:15. So if you want to know more about osmosis and how that works in plant cells, then definitely come tomorrow. But the permanent vacuole is needed for making sure that the concentration of water molecules is kept so that water keeps passing in to the root hair cell. Again, they've got lots of mitochondria. So they have lots of mitochondria because some minerals need to be actively transported through proteins in the membrane into the root hair cell. Again, we're going to cover this tomorrow. So tomorrow we're going to do diffusion, osmosis, and transport. So don't worry if you're not quite sure about how that works now. But it does take a lot of energy. So root hair cells need lots of mitochondria. So 3 things for root hair cells: increased surface area, permanent vacuole, lots of mitochondria. Okay. Photosynthetic cells. So plants make their own food via photosynthesis, and to do that, they need photosynthetic cells. They're normally present on the leaves in plants, and they have chloroplasts. We talked about chloroplasts before, but chloroplasts are the green organelle here. They contain the green pigment chlorophyll, and that's what extracts the energy from light for photosynthesis. Photosynthetic cells tend to be positioned in layers on the outer edge of the plant because they can absorb the most sunlight. So on the tops of leaves, for example. And as with all plant cells, they have a permanent vacuole which supports the leaf and helps with osmosis, so the transport of water. Again, we'll go into more detail on that tomorrow. So 3 things for photosynthetic cells: chloroplasts in layers on the outside of the leaves, stem, and a permanent vacuole to help keep its shape. Okay, and then the 2 last ones, Xylem and Phloem. We'll do Xylem first. So Xylem cells are specialized cells in plants that transport water and minerals from the roots to the leaves, so up the stem. Xylem cells are quite unique because they're dead. They don't live for very long. So they're formed and then they die very quickly. While they're forming, a substance called lignin builds itself in spirals around the cell and forms kind of a hard shell. So that's why the stems of plants tend to be so much kind of harder and more structured than leaves, because there's lots and lots of xylem vessels in there, lots of lignin. The lignin is really strong, means that they can withstand that pressure of water transport. And because they're not alive anymore, the ends of the cells have kind of died and gone away. So they don't have ends, and they're basically a straw. They're a hollow tube. So you can see in the diagram there's no ends to the cell, so it's just a long tube and this thick lignin around the outside. Okay, so 2 things for xylem cells: lignin, forming that strong outer wall, and they don't have ends, so they form a tube. Okay, and then the last type of plant cell that you need to learn for specialized cells is the Phloem cell. Phloem cells are specialized for carrying food made by the plant around the plant. So xylem vessels take water and minerals from the roots to the leaves, but phloem is designed for moving everything around, and they're quite often alongside each other, xylem and phloem. Phloem are very different to xylem. They're still alive, they're living cells. The cell walls between the cells, so here, remember xylem didn't have those anymore, so they're just a tube. But in phloem cells, they're kind of like a sieve. So they have these sieve plates in between. These are all cells stacked on top of each other. And so food and nutrients that's being moved around the plant is kind of sieved through these plates. They also have companion cells. So because they're a bit like a tube, they don't have many organelles within the cell, but instead they have companion cells alongside. So each of these would have a long companion cell along the side of it. And those companion cells have lots of mitochondria, and they can transfer energy to the phloem cell. So I'm going to draw one in. So companion cells are sort of here. They're literally very long, thin cells that form alongside. They'll have lots of mitochondria in them. All of those features of plant cells that we discussed. And they transfer energy to the phloem cell. Okay. So two things for phloem cells: sieve plates at the ends of the cells to allow movement between up and down those tubes, and supported by companion cells that have lots of mitochondria to give the phloem cells energy. Okay. Time for a mini quiz, and then we'll do another round of questions. So, again, not very imaginative questions on my part this week, but question 1, name one way that root hair cells are specialised for their function. So what do you remember? I think there were 3 things to remember for root hair cells. How are they specialised for their function? Pop your answers in the chat. Good, yeah, permanent vacuole, increased surface area, lots of mitochondria. Great, really, really good. Question 2, name one way that photosynthetic cells are specialised for their function. Lots of chlorophyll, yes, exactly. What's the name of the organelles that contain chlorophyll? Chloroplasts, yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Aidan. Okay. Anything else for photosynthetic cells? Where are they on a plant? Good. Tops of leaves, brilliant. Yeah, they help plants make their food. Where photosynthesis takes place, they're made in the leaves, brilliant. Okay. Number 3, name one way that Xylem cells are specialised for their function. Dead, long, rigid and sturdy, yep. Really good. So they have, yes, they carry water, that's their function. And they have to be sturdy in order to carry that water. What's the name of the material that makes Xylem cells so sturdy? Begins with L. Yes, lignin, an M. Okay. And finally, name one way that phloem cells are specialised for their function. So it's really important that you know the difference between xylem and phloem, and it can be quite confusing because they both look a bit like tubes. So what were the things that make phloem cells specialised? Sieve plates, good. They allow, so if you remember the walls between those stacked phloem cells had holes in, like sieves. And companion cells, good, yes. Sieve plates, yeah, brilliant. So the companion cells have lots of mitochondria, remember, for providing energy. For, yes, quite right, active transport, as Em said there. Really good. Okay. Fab. Well done, everyone. Has anyone got any questions? Anything at all that you've been wondering about for plant cells, animal cells, specialized cells, specialized plant cells, specialized animal cells? Pop it in the question and answer. I'll have a little scroll and see if there's any others that I've missed. Are photosynthetic cells the same as plant cells? So they have very similar, they're kind of the classic plant cell that I described right at the beginning. Photosynthetic cells have more chloroplasts than your average plant cell, and they're positioned in those particular places, whereas like root hair cells are underground, so they don't really have that many chloroplasts, if any. Some don't have any. So it's kind of that position that makes photosynthetic cells different to other plant cells. Why are phloem cells dead? That's a good question. And the answer is that they don't need to be alive. That's not the best answer I've ever given to a question. So Xylem cells are just tubes for transporting water. They're basically straws. And so that lignin is all that's needed to keep that structure. It's a waste of energy to provide organelles or anything else for that cell, and so the plant doesn't need them. It doesn't need them to be alive, so they're fine just being straws. Obviously they need to be alive while they're forming, but then once they're formed, they're just that structure. And someone said, why are phloem cells dead? Then why are phloem cells alive? Phloem cells are alive because so Xylem, which are the dead ones, I have just realized that question said, why are phloem cells dead? Phloem cells are alive, Xylem cells are dead. Phloem cells need to be alive because they're transporting some nutrients and things that need to be actively transported. So water moves up xylem passively. It doesn't require any extra energy. It's drawn up through those xylem vessels because water leaves plant leaves in transpiration. We did talk about this in plant organization a couple of weeks ago. So transpiration is the process of water leaving a plant leaf. It's an unavoidable consequence of photosynthesis because water is a waste product of photosynthesis. So it's needed. So when leaves open their pores to allow an exchange of gas, water escapes by evaporation. That means that leaves are quite often a bit devoid of water, and that means that water is drawn up from the stem. Water in the stem moving up means more water needs to be drawn into the roots, and so you have this continual flow of water through a plant. It's a passive process. Whereas phloem are transporting nutrients, and nutrients are at various different concentrations and sometimes need to be actively transported. So they need energy. And in order to do that, they need mitochondria. They need so many mitochondria that they have extra cells to give them more energy. Do root hair cells help us grow human hair? No. They are purely, they're only called root hair cells because they're so small that they look like hairs. Capillary reaction is something that we'll cover another time. Okay, just scrolling through. Don't think we've got any extra ones. Got 5 minutes. Someone's just asked, are viruses alive? No, viruses aren't technically alive. which is something that we talked about a little bit when we talked about communicable diseases. Viruses don't reproduce, they replicate. There's a slight difference. So they don't exchange any DNA, they literally just build copies of themselves. Okay, let's do some questions. So most of the questions that you get in exams about cell structure will be fairly kind of simple ones, a bit like this. So normally fill in the boxes or draw lines to or explain the function of, things like that. 1 or 2 mark questions. But although they're 1 or 2 mark questions, always read them properly, because it's very easy to make a mistake. I made a mistake when I was writing that question earlier. So here we have a diagram showing the structure of a bacterial cell. Okay, first thing we're thinking, bacterial cell, prokaryote, not animal or plant cell. On the diagram, use words from the box to label structures A, B, and C. Okay, so we know it's a bacterial cell, so it's going to have those differences from plant and animal cells that we discussed. So A looks as though it's surrounding the cell. B looks as though it's kind of the body, the sort of space of the cell. And C is that circular piece there. So in this case, A is the cell wall. I might just draw an arrow. So A is the cell wall. We know it's the cell wall because it's right around the outside and it's very thick. So bacteria have a cell wall. Plant cells also have a cell wall. Bacterial walls are made up of something different to plants. B is the cytoplasm. So the cytoplasm is kind of that body of the cell where chemical reactions take place. And C is a plasmid. C is one of those circular structures of DNA that we talked about that only bacteria have. It contains specialized cells, specialized genes, so genes for specific functions like antibiotic resistance. Okay. Give one difference between the structure of the bacterial cell and an animal cell. So we kind of talked about that a little bit. It's been quite specific here. They've said between bacterial cell and an animal cell. So in this case, you could have cell wall, because bacteria have them, but animal cells don't. You could also have plasmids. You could have that the DNA is loose in the cytoplasm rather than being in a nucleus. Okay, so lots that you could have there. And then name one structure that's found in a plant cell but not in a bacterial or an animal cell. Plant cell, not in a bacterial or an animal cell. Yep. So, what were those 3 things that we know are in plant cells but not in animal cells? They were chloroplasts, a vacuole, and a cell wall. But we know that bacteria have cell walls. So for this one, you could have permanent vacuole or chloroplasts. Okay. You would only need one of any of those. They're 1 mark questions, so you'd only need one. Finally, cells can be specialized for a particular job. Diagram shows the structure of a human sperm cell. So we can see the mitochondria and the long tail on the sperm cell there. Describe how the long tail and the mitochondria help the sperm to do its job. 4 marks for this one. So you need to provide good explanations for both. So for this, we would say that these never move when I need them to. Here we go. So the long tail helps to, let's put, allows sperm cell to travel long distance to the egg. The mitochondria are where respiration takes place to provide energy so that the sperm can travel long distance to the egg. Those would be my answers, spelled correct. Okay, so those would be the model answers there. Okay, we've got 1 minute left. Any final questions?
Sorry, I haven't seen anything else new come in, so it might be a good place to leave it there.
Okay, no problem.
Great, thank you everyone, and hopefully see you soon for some more sessions. Thank you, bye.
Perfect, bye everyone.